August 1942, America's 8th Air Force began combat operations from the windswept fields of East Anglia. Britain, battered by the Blitz and reeling from the fall of France, desperately needed to strike back at Nazi Germany. The stage was set for a new kind of warfare, high-altitude, strategic bombing. This was a campaign built on the promise of revolutionary technology. The Norden bomb sight, a top-secret device developed in the 1930s, pledged surgical precision, what theorists optimistically called pickle-barrel bombing. Brigadier General Ira C. Eaker, head of 8th Air Force bomber operations, championed a daring strategy. Daylight deep penetration missions with self-defending bomber formations. The idea was that concentrated firepower would mitigate the need for constant fighter escorts. But combat, as history repeatedly shows, always confounds theory. What unfolded was not a quick, decisive victory, but a slow, brutal battle of attrition. East Anglia, a history-haunted region, was transformed into a great battlefront of the world. Remote bomber bases, like Thorpe Abbott's, Station Number 139, housed 3,500 flyers and support personnel, each a tiny cog in a vast, unforgiving machine. The crews were often just boys, diverse in background, Harvard history majors, West Virginia coal miners, Wall Street lawyers, and Oklahoma cowpunchers, many of whom had never set foot in an airplane or fired a shot at anything more threatening than a squirrel. They piloted colossal vessels, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. These were death-dealing machines, built to fight near the stratosphere at altitudes 2 and 3 times that of World War I. But the skies above Germany offered no foxholes. By October 1943, the statistics were stark and utterly unforgiving. Fewer than 1 in 4 8th Air Force crew members could expect to complete a tour of 25 missions. 2/3 were expected to die or be captured. The immense human cost is perhaps the most enduring legacy. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission of August 17, 1943, exemplified this brutality, costing the 8th Air Force 60 bombers and nearly 600 men in a single day. The 100th Bomb Group alone lost 90 men on that raid. Among the ranks were figures like Major John Egan, a squadron commander known for his white fleece-lined flying jacket and idiomatic manner of speaking, who often flew into danger alongside his men. His best friend and fellow commander, Major Gale W.K. Cleven or Buck, was recognized by his officer's cap cocked on the side of his head and a toothpick dangling from his mouth. These were the men who faced the endless, unfamiliar killing space, only to return to clean sheets, hot food, and adoring English girls, a stark juxtaposition of peril and respite. It is important to note that the official Air Force policy prevented African Americans from flying in combat units of the 8th Air Force, a policy that would only later change. While the American 8th Air Force committed to daylight strategic bombing, the Royal Air Force, facing high inaccuracy rates in its own daylight efforts, had largely shifted to city busting under the cover of night, a strategy openly justified as a means to kill Germans and bolster British morale. The air war was the longest battle of World War II. It revolutionized warfare, introducing high-altitude, long-range strategic bombing as a primary offensive tool. By the spring of 1944, the increasing effectiveness of American bombing helped achieve air superiority, a critical turning point acknowledged by Winston Churchill. Yet, its strategic impact came at an unimaginable price. Over 26,000 8th Air Force flyers would lose their lives, a number exceeding the entire United States Marine Corps fatalities in the war. 77% of Americans flying against the Reich became casualties before D-Day. The relentless attrition, the constant replacement of crews, gave rise to a grim joke about the man who came to dinner and was gone the next day. As Buck Cleven once observed of the fresh replacements arriving, their fear wasn't as great as ours, and therefore was more dangerous. They feared the unknown. We feared the known. The known and the feared became devastatingly clear on October 8, 1943. The previous day had already delivered a brutal blow. Major Buck Cleven's Fortress, flying to Bremen, was shot down. He was the last to jump at 2,000 feet, landing unceremoniously in a German farmhouse kitchen to be met by a farmer with a pitchfork. The grim headline that day announced, 8th Air Force loses 30 fortresses over Bremen. It was a grim precursor to an even more controversial mission. The Münster raid, launched on the same day Cleven was lost, marked a significant and ethically fraught turning point in American bombing strategy. The stated aiming point was not just a marshalling yard, but explicitly the center of town and an adjacent neighborhood of workers' homes. This was a deliberate shift towards city busting, blurring the lines between military objective and civilian destruction. The loss of a revered, seemingly invincible pilot like Buck Cleven deeply affected squadron morale, igniting a fierce desire for vengeance. Major John Egan's words echoed this sentiment. "I want to pitch." Later he declared, "I am flying with you. We are going to get the bastards that got Buck." This mission, the third in 3 days for the 13th Combat Wing, further pushed already exhausted airmen to their limits. Pre-war, Colonel Dar H. Poinedy, Papi Alkier had starkly warned his airmen, "Don't get the notion that your job is going to be glorious or glamorous. You're going to be baby killers and women killers." His words now resonated with chilling prescience. The moral conflict was not universal, but it was real. Captain Ellis' scripture, confronting Colonel John Gerhardt over targeting civilians, was met with an explosive response. "Look, Captain, the target, by P-47 Thunderbolts, to the limit of their range, nearly all the way to the target. Beyond that point, Beyond Conscious was escorted by P-47. They were on their own, vulnerable to the relentless Luftwaffe, which now employed new air-to-air missiles and attacked Pacific bomb groups with devastating focus." Bomber crews described red balls of fire trailing long white plumes of smoke. Amidst this inferno, one crew stood out. Pilot Robert Rosie Rosenthal, a former Brooklyn College athlete and law school graduate, was driven by a profound hatred of persecution. His family was safely in Brooklyn, not a concentration camp, but his determination to strike at Nazism was absolute. Rosenthal's plane, Royal Flush, sustained catastrophic damage. A big rocket hole through the starboard wing, 2 engines were out, and gunners were injured. Yet Rosenthal remained calm, focused on bringing his men home. In one harrowing moment, Lieutenant John Harrow helped Bombardier Hambon Hamilton escape the plane, as Hamilton was hanging on the escape door, outside the plane, with nothing but 20,000 feet of air between his dangling feet and a ghastly end. The Münster raid was a devastating success from the perspective of destruction. 15-year-old Otto Schuet, a member of the Hitler Youth, witnessed smoke in dense clouds erupting. He saw a falling wing of a B-17, its propellers still spinning. A German soldier described Münster as an inferno, with injured people screaming who were trapped under demolished and burning houses. Almost all of the city centre had been flattened. For the 8th Er-17, Harry Crosby, a navigator, received the coded telephone report. "Egan's gone. Your old crew is gone. The whole group is gone." The only one who came back was that new crew in the 418th Squadron. They call their pilot Rosie. The 13th Combat Wing lost 25 of 30 fortresses destroyed that day, resulting in 300 lost airmen. Colonel Hubert Hubb, Zemke's Wolfpack, provided vital escort for the withdrawing shattered bombers. The Münster raid shattered the myth of the glorious mission, laying bare the dirty work of war and the profound psychological strain on airmen forced to confront the reality of civilian casualties. The early months of the American 8th Air Force's daylight strategic bombing campaign were a crucible of courage, devastating losses, and a profound learning curve. It was a period that fundamentally shaped the future of aerial warfare. Despite initial skepticism and an almost unimaginable human cost, the foundational idea of strategic bombing, championed by figures like Billy Mitchell, who envisioned bombers bypassing the static trench warfare of World War I, was now being tested in the unforgiving skies of Europe. But the campaign began under pressure. Washington and the press forced the 8th Air Force into combat before crews and tactics were fully ready. This led to significant bomber losses, driven by the inherent dangers of daylight bombing at high altitudes, often without adequate fighter escort. Crews were forced to learn by costly trial and error. On August 17, 1942, the 8th Air Force launched its first large-scale daylight heavy bomber raid on Rouen. Lieutenant Walt Kelly famously described it as a cakewalk. But this initial ease was a dangerous anomaly. Within a month after Rouen, as American bombers pushed beyond the protective range of Spitfire escorts, enemy fighter pilots began blowing Ika's bombers out of the sky with alarming regularity. Exactly 1 year to the day after the Rouen cakewalk, 5 times as many American bombers and airmen fell over Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The reality of air combat was brutal. Pilot Robert Rosenthal, who endured horrific missions, later expressed the profound survivor's guilt. Why had I lived when all those other good men died? Lieutenant Paul Vance, a pilot of Miss Carey, illustrated the extreme self-reliance required at 25,000 feet, bandaging his own severed leg with an interfoam cord. Lieutenant Robert Sabel, pilot of Rusty Load, epitomized resilience, bringing his heavily damaged bomber home with 4 crewmen dead, landing on 2 engines with near-empty fuel tanks. Harry Crosby, an observer of the mounting losses, noted the devastating attrition rate within the Bloody 100th Bomb Group. Only 3 of its 140 initial officers remained on flying status. The 100th, a pioneer fortress group, lost over 200 men in 1 week, almost half its airmen, including 2 squadron leaders. Such losses, which would eventually claim an estimated 26,008 Air Force crew members, led captured airmen to realize they were losing the air war, a stark contrast to official pronouncements. The fate of downed airmen was grim. American prisoners of war debated if they would be held for up to 10 years, enduring cramped, unheated cells with about 1 million fleas, and traveling to prison camps in vile boxcars that had been used to haul livestock. Even the smallest details of early operations were telling. The first blood spilled by American heavy bomber crews was caused by a collision with a pigeon. Their miserably drained base earned the nickname Grafton Undermud. The Münster raid, occurring later on October 10, 1943, resulted in nearly 700 civilian casualties, highlighting the indiscriminate nature of aerial warfare. For the 13th Combat Wing, 25 of 30 fortresses were destroyed that day, with 300 airmen lost. The human cost was also evident in the grim efficiency of military routine. Within an hour of crewmen failing to return, their bunks were stripped and their belongings bagged. The campaign fundamentally altered the nature of warfare, ushering in an era of strategic bombing with long-term global implications. It debunked the hopeful dogma that the bomber will always get through, and underscored that success depended not just on generals' decisions, but on the skill and courage of small combat teams, operating independently in the chaos of battle. The concept of strategic bombing, though brutal in its execution, was born from a desperate search for a quicker, more decisive end to war than the grinding attrition of World War I's trenches. Visionary, but often ostracized, figures like Billy Mitchell and Julio Duet believed air power could fundamentally reshape military doctrine. Mitchell, dubbed Napoleon of the Air, was a fierce advocate for an autonomous air force. During World War I, in September 1918, he proposed to General Pershing a vast air offensive behind enemy lines. Though initially rejected, this foreshadowed his lifelong advocacy. After the armistice on November 11, 1918, Mitchell was already planning strategic assaults on the German homeland. He found inspiration in Air Marshal Hugh Trenchard, the Royal Air Force's founding father and a proponent of bomber warfare. The German bombing of London with dirigibles and Gotha bombers in 1917, which killed almost 1,400 people, demonstrated the vulnerability of civilian populations and spurred retaliatory strategies. Mitchell defiantly challenged the traditional military orthodoxy that airplanes could not sink battleships. In July 1921, his air fleet sank the captured German battleship Ostfriesland with 6 2,000-pound bombs, a dramatic public demonstration of air power's destructive potential. His relentless advocacy for an independent air force led to his court-martial in 1925. Mitchell died in 1936, his vision largely unfulfilled, but his ideas would soon be institutionalized. General Giulio Douhet, an Italian air commander and influential theorist, in his seminal work, The Command of the Air, advocated for the strategic bombing of civilian and industrial centers, arguing it could cripple an enemy's will and capacity to fight. The Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field became the intellectual cradle for these theories. Here, figures like Major Haywood S. Hansel refined the doctrine, arguing for daylight precision bombing to target industries rather than indiscriminately attacking morale, believing that economic paralysis would be more strategically effective. This new doctrine was made theoretically possible by the Norden bombsight, developed by Carl L. Norden starting in 1931. This gyroscope-stabilized instrument, which computed drift and dropping angle, promised high-altitude precision bombing. At approximately $1.50 billion, the cost of 90,000 Norden bomb sites would eventually represent 65% of the cost of the Manhattan Project itself. The B-17 Flying Fortress, first flown in prototype in 1935, with four 750 horsepower radial engines, became the physical embodiment of this strategic vision. Faster than contemporary fighters, capable of carrying a normal bomb load of 4,000 pounds at 25,000 feet, and bristling with 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns in its final G model, the B-17 was designed for long-range, high-altitude missions. Its combat radius of 650 to 800 miles and speeds of 150 to 250 miles per hour were revolutionary. Early pioneers, like Hap Arnold, who led 10 two-engine bombers on a flight from Washington State to Alaska and back in 1934, and Carl Spaatz and Ira Eker, who set a world endurance record of over 150 hours in the question mark in 1929 using mid-air refueling, foreshadowed the long-range capabilities that would define the air war. By the summer of 1937, the Air Corps was still fighting for funds, with only 7 B-17s operational, but the Munich Conference of September 1938 signaled the looming threat of war, leading to increased funding and prioritization for the Air Corps and bomber development. This period saw the creation of a new military doctrine focused on strategic bombing, the controversial concept of targeting civilian populations as a legitimate military objective, and the emergence of the military-industrial complex dedicated to mass production of warplanes. It was a vision that promised to end wars quickly, but would, in practice, unleash unprecedented destruction. The escalating global conflict, particularly after the Munich crisis, galvanized American leadership. President Franklin Roosevelt, a devoted Navy man, became convinced that air power would win the inevitable war. He drove a stupendous expansion of American air power, initiating a battle of the White House and a subsequent battle of production. When France fell in May 1940, Roosevelt urgently called for an annual output of 50,000 planes. This was a staggering ambition. The American aircraft industry had an initial capacity of only 2,000 planes per year. Yet, through an unprecedented national effort, production rapidly increased to over 4,000 a month. Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Corps, was the driving force behind this industrial mobilization. Known for his vigor and imagination, he famously declared, "The difficult we do today, the impossible takes a little longer." Arnold immediately acquired $1.5 billion for Air Force development, a massive investment that transformed the U.S. military. From 1,200 combat aircraft and 22,700 personnel pre-war, the U.S. Air Force grew to nearly 340,000 personnel and almost 3,000 combat planes by December 1941. By 1944, the Army Air Forces commanded 80,000 planes and 2.4 million flyers and support personnel, comprising 31% of the total Army strength. In March 1944 alone, American factories produced over 9,000 military planes. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 united the nation and solidified the defeat Germany first strategy. This accelerated the deployment of American air power to Europe, even if it was nascent and not fully prepared. In January 1942, Arnold created the 8th Air Force, appointing his protégé, Ira Eker, to command its bombardment force. Eker, known for his ambition and diplomatic skill, departed for England on February 4, 1942, with 6 staff officers. By February 1942, the 8th Air Force in England consisted of just 7 men and no planes. By December 1943, it would swell to 185,000 men and 4,000 planes. Meanwhile, Britain had endured the brutal reality of air war. The German Blitz of 1940–41 killed 30,000 Londoners and injured 50,000, with 43,000 British civilians dying from German air raids overall. Early in the war, Roosevelt had insisted on moral restraint in air warfare. But the desperate military situation and the British experience began to shift strategy. After the bombing of Rotterdam, Churchill authorized Bomber Command to attack Ruhr and Rhineland targets in May 1940. The RAF's first large-scale strategic bombing raid on German targets occurred on May 15, 1940. An accidental Luftwaffe raid on London, on August 24, 25, 1940, prompted Churchill to order a reprisal raid on Berlin. The subsequent German blitz on London, beginning September 7, 1940, intensified the air war. Initially, British bombing doctrine focused on military targets. However, the Butt Report of summer 1941 revealed the abysmal accuracy of British night bombing, finding that only one-third of planes dropped bombs within 5 miles of the aiming point. In the Ruhr, accuracy was as low as 10%. This devastating assessment led to a strategic shift towards deliberately targeting German civilian areas, a move towards terror bombing exemplified by the bombing of Coventry in November 1940 and the terror raid on Mannheim in mid-December 1940. In August 1941, planners like Haywood Hansell drafted Air War Plans Division 1, or AWPD-1. This blueprint forecasted the needs and defined the Air Force's supreme mission to defeat Germany. However, it was based on flawed assumptions, practice bombing runs in cloudless weather, at low altitudes, and without simulated resistance. It underestimated the need for long-range fighter escorts and called for the wrong type of bomber, a large, heavily armed warship. The rapid and massive expansion of American air power, driven by visionary leaders and wartime necessity, transformed the U.S. into the world's dominant air force. It was a critical, albeit initially imperfect, factor in Allied victory and fundamentally reshaped warfare through an unprecedented industrial-military government partnership. The establishment and early development of the 8th Air Force in Britain was a contentious process, shaped by differing strategic philosophies, political pressures, and the harsh realities of combat. This doctrine, championed by Ira Eaker and supported by Air Marshal Arthur Harris, aimed to cripple Nazi Germany through industrial destruction and worker attrition. It was a strategy that, while brutal, was seen by its proponents as militarily necessary and morally justifiable in the context of total war. On February 22, 1942, Air Marshal Arthur Harris assumed command of RAF Bomber Command. Known as Bomber Harris, he was a blunt advocate of area bombing, convinced that bombing alone could bring Germany to its knees. He dismissed the notion of social revolution as a primary goal of morale bombing, calling it a chimera. Instead, Harris focused on tangible industrial destruction and the attrition of skilled labor, noting that good workers took longer to produce than good machines. Harris's day-housing euphemism stood in stark contrast to his admitted terror bombing. He found a grim satisfaction in displaying three-dimensional aerial photographs of the enemy cities his crews were destroying on a stereopticon machine. His chilling quote, "I kill thousands of people every night," highlighted his pragmatic, brutal logic. By March 1942, British bombers began using the new G navigational aid. On May 30, 1942, Churchill announced the RAF's 1-070-42, Operation Millennium, a massive undertaking marshalling 1,046 bombers, including obsolete training aircraft, to compensate for Harris's initial force of fewer than 400 serviceable planes, only 69 of which were heavy bombers. The Cologne raid killed nearly 500 people, left 45,000 homeless, destroyed 12,000 buildings, and cost 41 British aircraft. Meanwhile, on June 10, 1942, the troopship Queen Elizabeth docked in the Firth of Clyde, carrying the first contingent of the 8th Air Force, primarily air gunners of the 97th Bomb Group. On July 1, 1942, the first B-17, manned by an American combat crew, landed in Great Britain. This occurred as German army victories in Sevastopol and Tobruk created immense pressure on the Allies. In July 1942, Roosevelt controversially agreed to the Allied landing in North Africa, Operation Torch, indefinitely postponing the long-anticipated cross-channel invasion. This placed immense pressure on the nascent 8th Air Force to prove its worth quickly and to resist the threat of being absorbed into RAF night operations. Eaker, known for his soft-spoken demeanor and practical approach, worked closely with Harris. Despite their differing philosophies, a mutual respect formed, united by a shared commitment to crushing Nazi Germany. Eaker secured 8 former RAF air bases and began planning for over 100 additional American bases in East Anglia. The transformation of the English countryside was profound. Polebrook Airfield, for instance, had recently been a potato patch. The 8th Air Force's early headquarters were located in a picturesque Wycombe Abbey School for girls, codenamed Pine Tree, with amusing details like bells for mistresses still in place. Getting the American aircraft to England was a feat in itself, requiring a challenging Great Circle route, with stepping stones via Newfoundland, Labrador, Greenland, and Iceland. Bluey West 1, a base in Greenland, was described as a forbidding place with a precariously narrow fjord, highlighting the extreme conditions and dangers of early operations. On September 6, 1942, the 8th Air Force launched its first combat mission. It was a brutal awakening. 2 fortresses erupted in flames. Paul Tibbets, who led the mission and would later command the 97th Bomb Group, experienced harrowing combat. A cannon shell smashed through his cockpit's right-hand window, and his co-pilot, Gene Lockhart, had part of his right hand blown off. Colonel Newton D. Longfellow, commander of the 2nd Bombardment Wing, displayed alarming panic, grabbing a handful of throttles and turbo controls. German Messerschmitt Bf 109s swarmed like a nest of angry hornets, their guns from all our planes spitting fire like mad. The significant losses shattered any perception of invincibility and forced a grim reckoning with the realities of air combat. On October 9, 1942, the 8th Air Force's mission to Lille demonstrated a growing capability. A force of 108 heavies, including 24 twin-tailed B-24 Liberators on their first combat sortie with the 8th, were dispatched. This mission was covered by over 400 fighters, including P-38 Lightnings and Spitfires, flown by pilots of the famed Eagle squadrons, demonstrating the evolving nature of air operations. Yet, figures like Major Gardiner Gordy Fisk, a group intelligence officer with World War I experience, found his outdated knowledge a stark illustration of the rapid evolution of aerial warfare. The psychological impact of these early combat losses forced a rapid transition from youthful confidence to grim determination, defining the character of those who served. The early months of the 8th Air Force's daylight strategic bombing campaign were marked by significant teething problems, from inexperienced crews and flawed intelligence to unreliable technology. These challenges led to exaggerated claims of success that masked fundamental weaknesses and an immense human cost. Despite this, the persistent Allied bombing would eventually contribute to an oppressive demand on German air defenses. The Lille raid in October 1942 was the first real brawl for the 8th Air Force. 4 bombers were lost, and 46 were damaged. Official claims reported an astounding 102 German fighters destroyed. However, German records showed only 2 actual losses. This stark discrepancy revealed the rampant overestimation and misidentification of targets by inexperienced gunners and navigators, who often fell prey to an initial field day mentality. Co-pilot Kemp McLaughlin witnessed firsthand the fear and inexperience of crews. During the Lille mission, flak hit the wing of his B-17. The radio operator screamed, and his squadron commander, Major Robert Keck, paralyzed by fear, was preparing to bail out even as his bombardier could not sight targets due to evasive actions. This period was a fool's paradise, as one commander put it, where public and high-level reporting, driven by a need for positive news and a strong belief in precision bombing, masked the true ineffectiveness and dangers faced by the 8th. The Norden bomb site, valued at $10,000 and praised for pickle-barrel accuracy, was difficult to operate in combat conditions, sensitive to pilot evasive action, and susceptible to haze and flak. When asked about his bomb site's precision, Carl Norden himself sardonically asked, "Which pickle would you like to hit?" Bombing accuracy was poor and recurrent, making the concept of hitting specific targets in populated areas highly problematic. At least 40 civilians were killed in Lille, 150 at Lorient, and 140 at Rouen. The unintended casualties of this imprecise war. The diversion of resources and experienced personnel to Operation Torch. The North African invasion, launched on November 8, 1942, severely depleted the 8th Air Force. Over 27,000 men and 1,200 aircraft were siphoned off, jeopardizing its nascent strategic bombing mission. This was a critical setback. In the Battle of the Atlantic, Admiral Donit's wolf packs inflicted devastating losses. In 1942 alone, over 1,000 Allied ships were sunk. November 1942 was the worst month, with 116 ships lost. Winston Churchill called the Battle of the Atlantic the dominating factor all through the war, confessing, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. In response, ICA opened the assault on the colossal Lorient U-boat pens on October 21, 1942. These pens were a formidable challenge, requiring 15,000 slave laborers to construct 3 colossal enclosures with 25-foot-thick concrete roofs, using 3/4 of the concrete for the Hoover Dam. General Spaatz assessed them as hard, maybe impossible nuts to crack. Early bombing attempts were notoriously ineffective, with bombs bouncing off U-boat shelters like ping-pong balls. St. Nazaire became known as Flak City due to its heavily armed German anti-aircraft batteries, which unleashed 88mm cannons firing 20-pound explosive shells. Despite these struggles, German complacency created a dangerous gap. Hitler and Luftwaffe leadership focused on the Eastern Front, and Wonder weapons underestimated the potential of Allied daylight bombing. In the fall of 1942, German leadership considered the air war over the Western Reich a sideshow. Göring dismissed B-17s as flying coffins, yet, as Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, head of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, recognized, his pilots were insufficiently prepared to engage the Boeings, as the Germans called B-17, whose colossal defensive armament made them dangerous targets. The hard-won lessons from these early failures, particularly regarding German defensive vulnerabilities, laid the groundwork for the eventual strategic bombing dominance of the war. The early years of the 8th Air Force in Europe were characterized by a brutal, high-stakes struggle against both German air defenses and the unforgiving elements. This crucible of combat forged an extraordinary bond of camaraderie among crews, who faced near-certain death daily. It fundamentally redefined aerial warfare, shifting from individual heroism to a complex, team-oriented fight for survival. The F-190S from JG2, led by Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, posed a specific, innovative threat. Meyer observed a weak spot in their defenses in the nose section of the bombers. While some forts had only one handheld .30 caliber machine gun, others had twin .50 caliber nose guns. Meyer's tactic was devastatingly simple: waves of 2 to 4 planes, flying wingtip to wingtip, firing from all buttonholes, at an effective range of between 1,000 and 600 meters. This shifted the dynamics of air combat for American bombers. The impact was immediate. For the 306 Bomb Group, 30% of its pilots and co-pilots were killed in action in its first missions in early October 1942. A morale-building poster, "Who's Afraid of the New Focke-Wulf?" with an invitation to sign here, underscored the psychological impact and shared dread among airmen. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, recalled the agony of the ride to the plains, a profound pre-flight anxiety shared by all. His pre-takeoff huddle ritual with his crew illustrated a deeply human coping mechanism for fostering unity. The Memphis Belle flew its first mission on November 7th against the submarine pens at Brest. Life inside a B-17 was one of cramped quarters and extreme danger. It was like a lightweight aluminum cigar tube with closely spaced aluminum ribs and thin skin. In the waist gunner position, the backs of the waist gunners nearly touched when they stood and fired through their open port windows. The ball turret, only 30 inches in diameter, left no room for his parachute, forcing gunners to jettison it before emergency escapes. The pilot and co-pilot way, riding as on the bridge of a ship, were surrounded by over 150 switches, dials, cranks, handles, and gauges. The bomb bay, a narrow 18-inch wide catwalk, was where bombs hung like huge black fish fixed on skewers. The top turret gunner also served as the engineer/mechanic, a multifaceted, critical role. Navigators relied on astrodome observations to determine the relationship of the stars to Earth, and so deduce our position. The bombardiere occupied the most exposed position in the plane. A typical mission day began at 4 a.m., with breakfast at 4:30, briefing at 5:15, and takeoff at 6:15. Briefings emphasized precision and responsibility. Don't drop your bombs indiscriminately. If you can't bomb any targets, don't jettison on open cities, bring your bombs home. Religious rituals, such as absolution, communion, and the Lord's Prayer, were common before missions as men faced imminent death. The operational environment was brutally cold. Early in the war, electrically heated suits, gloves, and boots were available for only 2 or 3 crew members on each bomber. Waist gunners, in their open ports, slid like donkeys on ice on piles of spent shells, often experiencing sweat at 40 degrees below zero. The impact of German fighters was palpable, attribute, MHR, and piles of Pemisted. Crewmen reported cannon holes in his plane big enough to shove sheep through from Fra 190s. Flak exploded with such force that the concussions would have driven the pilots through the roofs of their planes. A lead bombardier's faulty Norden bomb sight on the Brest mission was a specific instance of technical failure impacting mission outcome. After missions, airmen underwent interrogation and debriefing, often accompanied by shots of whiskey. The fallen were memorialized by painting the names of those we lost on the barracks walls. The selfless sacrifice of Technical Sergeant Arizona T. Harris on Sons of Fury, belly landing and continuing to fire his .50 caliber guns into the sea, is a testament to the crew's loyalty. Ernie Pyle, the famed war correspondent, observed that the era of the giant battleship of the air, the lone, gay-hearted, swashbuckling hero of the sky, is likely to become more and more rare. Grow further elucidated this shift, stating that these men are not interested in democracy or freedom. They are interested in their buddies or team. The diverse crew occupations on Hell's Angels, car salesman, rancher, gas attendant illustrated the broad spectrum of backgrounds united by this mission. Weather was a primary adversary. By early October, it was seriously debated whether it was feasible to conduct a full-scale offense of this sort from British bases. Only 5 to 8 days a month were possible for sizable strikes, and visual bombing was achievable between 20 and 30% of the time. The early years forged an unbreakable bond among survivors, a shared trauma, a profound respect for their crewmates, and a deep-seated understanding of mortality that transcended normal social interactions. The high casualty rates and profound psychological toll on American 8th Air Force bomber crews were not solely due to enemy action. They were significantly exacerbated by a severe lack of preparedness, inadequate technology, and a nascent understanding of the extreme physiological and psychological demands of high-altitude aerial combat. This failure to adequately address these environmental and medical challenges constituted a self-inflicted wound on the air war effort. Weather, though often predictable in its adverse effects, reduced operations by 45%. 10% of planes aborted or were recalled due to rapidly changing conditions, prolonging the stressful pre-flight tension for crews. The extreme cold at high altitudes, often 40 degrees below zero, coupled with inadequate protective gear, led to widespread frostbite. In the 8th's first year, 1,634 men were removed from flying duty for frostbite, over 400 more than for combat wounds. Electrically heated suits, though a vital concept, were notoriously undependable. They often shorted out, sent shocks, and burned out due to lack of proper care, as men wrapped them in a ball. Oxygen equipment was similarly flawed. Saliva or vomit could freeze in masks, blocking hoses and causing anoxia. The indicator ball, meant to show oxygen flow, was often unheeded by crews who were focused on survival. 50 to 60% of flyers experienced some form of anoxia, though fewer than 100 men died directly from it. 2/3 of cases of temporary removal from flying status were due to aerotitus media, an ear condition caused by rapid changes in air pressure. Medical ignorance in aviation medicine was profound. Flight surgeons, like Captain William F. Sheely, began to study frostbite and warn of its dangers only in the midwinter of 1942 to 43. Primitive measures, such as urine tubes in ball turrets and thin silk gloves to be worn under heavier heated gloves, were implemented. Colonel Malcolm Grow, the 8th Air Force's chief medical officer, and his assistant, Colonel Harry G. Armstrong, were instrumental in establishing the Central Medical Establishment, or CME, a dedicated institution for aviation medicine. Their work led to systematic research and development, eventually improving survival rates. The lack of an organized American air-sea rescue system was another devastating failure. In the first year of operations, 99% of 8th Air Force flyers who went into the sea were lost. Lieutenant Donald Swenson's crew, forced to ditch in the North Sea after the historic Lille mission on October 9, 1942, provided a first-hand account of this brutal reality. One of their self-inflating rubber rafts was riddled with bullet holes and failed to inflate properly. Fortunately, the RAF's air/sea rescue service, whose machinery went into high gear, saved Swenson's crew, highlighting the British capability the 8th initially lacked. Amidst these perils, the independent Comet Line escape network provided a crucial lifeline. Led by André de Jong, or Deddy, this elaborate, highly secret operation ran 1,200 miles through safe houses, trains, bicycles, and foot travel. It aided approximately 700 of the 5,000 to 6,000 downed Allied airmen, significantly boosting morale and returning valuable personnel to the war effort. Deddy was arrested in January 1943, but the line continued. She was freed from Ravensbrück in 1945, later to work in a leper colony. The need for solutions forced the development of aviation medicine, establishing precedents for protecting aircrews in future conflicts. The arrival of Major Curtis E. LeMay in October 1942 signaled a shift in strategic thinking, implying a move towards more effective, and eventually less costly, bombing tactics. These early experiences demonstrated that crew survival was intrinsically linked to mission success, prompting a crucial reassessment of tactics and preparation. Early American air power doctrine, driven by theoretical ideals of high-altitude, precise bombing, was fundamentally flawed and ill-suited for the brutal realities of combat. The crucible of war, under pragmatic leaders like Curtis LeMay, forced a necessary evolution towards more effective, albeit more destructive, bombing tactics. The pre-war theorists, represented by figures like Brigadier General Haywood Possum Hansel, envisioned pinpoint accuracy, but combat reality was far different. Colonel Frank Armstrong, an experienced combat pilot, described the terrifying effectiveness of German flak. If you fly straight and level through it for more than 10 seconds, you're a dead duck. This created a dilemma: evasive action to avoid flak sacrificed bombing accuracy. Into this theoretical-practical chasm stepped Major Curtis LeMay, who took command of the 305th Bomb Group in April 1942, at just 35 years old. LeMay, a fanatic about discipline and brilliantly persuasive, lacked formal military schooling in air power theory. His direct combat experience fostered a pragmatic approach that prioritized effectiveness over theoretical purity. He was so formidable that his own men, including Gail Cleven, admitted, "We were more afraid of him than Hitler." Bested LeMay's disciplinary credo was clear: "I can forgive a mistake once anyway, but God help you if you ever lie to me." He challenged the evasive bombing tactic with a crucial question: if you cannot fly straight and level for more than 10 seconds, how are you going to get bombs on the target? His radical solution: bombers must fly straight and level to ensure accuracy. He implemented a lead cruise system, utilizing skilled navigators and bombardiers equipped with Norden bomb sights and automatic flight control equipment, which allowed bombardiers to fly the plane through the bomb site for increased stability. Pilot Craig Harris described it: "AFC held you so straight and rigid you thought you were on railroad tracks." On November 23, 1942, the 305th Bomb Group flew its first combat mission over Saint Nazaire, implementing LeMay's new tactics. They dropped twice the number of bombs on target compared to other groups, demonstrating significantly improved accuracy and, surprisingly, a lack of flak-induced losses. Later, overall bombing accuracy tripled with on-the-leader bombing, even if it remained erratic. The Germans, however, quickly adapted. On January 3, 1943, over Saint Nazaire, they unleashed a devastating predicted barrage of flak, creating a lethal field 500 feet wide and 1,000 feet high and deep. This barrage highlighted the inadequacy of individual bomber defense. The average B-17 flying dead level required 272 rounds of ammunition to be hit, but a concentrated barrage drastically increased the odds. This forced a shift towards formation flying for mutual protection, leading to the development of the combat box. Composed of 18 to 21 bombers, this formation provided concentrated fire covering 1,000 yards in every direction. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany employed false radio beams designed to mislead Allied navigators. The early months saw high losses, with rates ranging from 3.7% to 8% of attacking bombers in the months following LeMay's initial successes. A pivotal moment occurred in January 1943 at the Casablanca Conference. General Hap Arnold initially conveyed grim news to Ira Eaker. "Ira, I've got bad news for you. President Roosevelt has agreed, at Mr. Stabis President has agreed, at Mr. Tumig Bit, Churchill's request, that your 8th Air Force will cease daylight bombing and join the RF in night bombing. Ika, however, passionately argued for the continuation of daylight bombing, stressing the unique strategic value of American precision. Churchill, known for his pragmatism, ultimately conceded. "You have not entirely converted me to your view. When I see your president at lunch today, I shall tell him that I withdraw my suggestion that you discontinue your daylight bombing and join us in the night bombing effort." The decision to pursue a round-the-clock bombing strategy was formalized, committing to both British night bombing and American daylight bombing to disrupt German industry and morale. On January 27, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched its first penetration of German airspace, targeting submarine yards at Wilhelmshaven. LeMay's innovations led to the adoption of lead crews and the combat box, fundamentally shaping the air war. This period marks a critical transition from theoretical air power to a brutal, pragmatic application, laying the groundwork for the greatest campaign of urban and economic devastation in the history of warfare. The early campaigns of the 8th Air Force in Europe, while hailed for their strategic bombing potential and the heroism of their airmen, were characterized by immense human cost, exaggerated success, and the profound psychological toll on young men, all amplified by a carefully managed public relations machine. The initial perceived invincibility of daylight strategic bombing led to ambitious raids without adequate fighter protection, often making them sacrificial. The Luftwaffe, adapting quickly, developed new tactics, such as using twin-engine German planes to bomb bomber streams from 2,000 feet above, demonstrating a new level of Nazi determination. The War Department, desiring impactful war reporting and propaganda, integrating journalists and filmmakers into bombing missions. On February 26, the Wilhelmshaven raid included 8 reporters, dubbed the Writing 69th, or the Flying Typewriters, forcing them to confront the risks and the human element of the air war. Andy Rooney, a reporter for Stars and Stripes who flew on Lieutenant Bill Casey's bomber, Banshee, experienced the dangers firsthand. Walter Cronkite, a United Press correspondent, even underwent gunnery school and flew missions himself. Hollywood entered the fray. William Wyler, director of Mrs. Casey's correspondent, Miniver became a major and insisted on flying combat missions with his camera crew to capture authentic footage. After losing their 35mm equipment, they switched to handheld 16mm cameras. His documentary focused on Captain Robert Morgan's B-17, Memphis Belle, which became a symbol of the airman spirit. Its nose art, often featuring pin-up girls, cartoon icons, or fire-breathing dragons, influenced by commercial artists like George Petty, Gil L. Vigrain, and Alberta Vargas, was a way of holding on to our individuality or sense of humor. Clark Gable, the Hollywood star, joined the Air Force in April 1943, serving with the 351st Bomb Group and enduring combat himself to prove his dedication while filming the training film Combat America. The immense pressure to demonstrate victory and secure funding led to deliberate exaggeration of bombing raid effectiveness and enemy losses. General Ika's announcement after the Vegesack raid, declaring the end of experimental days and signaling a shift towards concentrated daylight bombing, was built on claims that were massively exaggerated. While places like Saint-Saintified, Nazaire and Lorient were described as having ceased to exist as habitable human communities, Admiral Donitz's reports confirmed that the U-boat pens remained fully functional. The numbers game of war, as one observer noted, often obscured the true impact. This period saw devastating losses. LeMay's 305th Bomb Group lost nearly half its crews. Other Pioneer Fortress groups were down to 20% of their original personnel. Bombers too damaged to fly were cannibalized as hangar queens. The psychological strain of constant combat and mounting losses led to widespread emotional disintegration among airmen. Symptoms included insomnia, anxiety, aggression, and terrifying nightmares. The monthly dances held at operational groups have been marked by numbers of violent fights, and airmen sometimes seduced women in quantity, not for sexual satisfaction, but for the sake of subduing and conquering their unrelieved anxiety. This grim reality stood in stark contrast to popular narratives like Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation and challenged pre-war critiques of American youth culture, such as Philip Wiley's Generation of Vipers. The tragic story of the Mathis brothers epitomized the immense personal cost. Jack Mathis, a bombardier, was killed on the Duchess, a bomber he shared with his brother Mark, he was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the first for a flyer in the 8th. Mark Mathis, now fueled by animosity towards the Germans, continued to fly. The final moments of some airmen were horrific. A ball turret gunner, trapped in his plastic cage as his plane crash-landed, was mashed between the concrete pavement of the runway and the belly of the bomber. The narrative highlights deliberate exaggeration of enemy losses and bomb tonnage effectiveness to maintain public support and secure resource. The campaign inflicted profound psychological damage on a generation of young men, a cost often unacknowledged amidst the celebration of heroism. The intense, prolonged exposure to combat stress in aerial warfare inevitably leads to psychological breakdown in a significant percentage of airmen. This was a reality often masked by organizational denial, stigma, and inadequate treatment. True recovery required safety, not simply a return to the battlefield. Virtually every flyer who completed a tour of combat duty suffered from one or more of the symptoms of combat fatigue. This condition, also known as operational fatigue, was a genuine medical response to prolonged intermittent terror, not a character flaw. The stark contrast between the relative safety of the base and the extreme peril of aerial combat exacerbated anxiety. Airmen joked they were flak happy or had the Focke-Wulf jitters. Symptoms included hysteria reactions, shakes and tremors, fainting spells, temporary blindness. Symptoms included hysteria reactions, shakes and tremors, fainting spells, and catatonia. Pilot Clint Hammond had to revive a co-pilot who passed out from fear during a maiden mission with a wild punch to the head. Another co-pilot went temporarily blind every time he crossed into Holland. A tail gunner, after surviving a severed tail section incident, and expressed into Holland Strait, experienced dreams of ghastly crashes and could not tolerate whistling or whining noises. The Air Force's initial response was often to ground men for lack of moral fiber, or LMF, and discharge them without honor. Of an estimated 225,000 airmen, only between 4,000 and 5,000 were treated as emotional casualties, with around 2,100 permanently grounded for neuropsychiatric disorders. By the winter of 1943, emotional disorders became the most frequent cause of long-term removals from flying for the 8th Air Force. Lord Moran, author of The Anatomy of Courage, theorized courage as a finite willpower that could be depleted by prolonged stress, a concept that challenged the notion of courage as an inexhaustible, innate quality. The Mediterranean theater experience revealed that fully 1/3 of non-fatal casualties were psychiatric, prompting closer examination by the 8th Air Force. Dr. Psychiatric, prompting closer examination by the 8th Air Force. Malcolm Grow, the 8th Air Force's chief medical officer, alerted ICA to the alarming increase in flight fatigue. He reported 73 war-weary crews and pleaded for a reduced mission limit. General ICA initially refused pleas to limit missions to 15, eventually agreeing to 25. This was later increased to 30 in March 1944 and 35 in July 1944, despite the clear evidence of psychological strain. The pressure to return men to combat led to aggressive, and sometimes flawed, therapeutic techniques. Early 1943, 69 men were given narcosis treatment with sodium amytal, allowing men to believe traumatic events happened 2 days ago. Roy Grinker and Major John P. Spiegel pioneered truth serum treatments with sodium pentothal in North Africa. Patients were induced to relive trauma, wandering and cowering as if back in combat. Of those 69 men, 38 were put back in the air. However, when Dr. Douglas Bond replaced Hastings and discontinued pentothal therapy, applying stricter criteria, a significant drop in cure rates occurred. Lieutenant David G. Wright, a field consultant in psychiatry, flew on combat missions himself to understand airmen's experiences, writing pioneering reports. Captain Wendell C. Smokey Stover, an exemplary flight surgeon, navigated the dilemma of torn loyalties, healing his men versus the duty to return them to flying. The stark truth emerged. True healing, Air Force doctors would eventually discover, only occurred in an atmosphere of safety. This meant the absolute cessation of flying combat missions. The emotional casualties were as inevitable as physical wounds, directly proportional to the intensity and duration of exposure. The poignant example of 4 flying fortress gunners who refused to abandon a trapped comrade ultimately dying with him, underscores the profound bonds and the ultimate sacrifice. The recognition of the psychological toll of aerial warfare laid crucial groundwork for understanding combat stress and post-traumatic stress in future conflicts. The recognition of the psychological toll of aerial warfare laid crucial groundwork for understanding combat stress and post-traumatic stress in future conflicts. This immense personal risk and isolation, a constant companion in the skies, fostered a unique coping mechanism. Airmen retreated into gallows humor, a dark laughter in the face of death, and strengthened personal connections. Their focus narrowed to immediate survival, finding solace in camaraderie and shared experience. This shift in priorities rendered political lectures on morale utterly ineffective. The early period of the 8th Air Force's bombing campaign was defined by devastatingly high losses. Unchecked Luftwaffe fighter strength was a primary cause. Bombers pushed deep into German territory, often without crucial long-range escorts, leaving them tragically vulnerable. A pre-war overemphasis on bomber self-sufficiency and a misjudgment of technological feasibility had delayed the development of these vital escorts. The consequences were unsustainable casualty rates and severely impacted airman morale. Promises of sufficient crews and aircraft, the unkept promise of replacements and support were consistently unmet. This operational overextension prolonged the combat tour of the pioneer groups. The strain was immense. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th, sent a blistering report to Hap Arnold, U.S. Army Air Force's Chief of Staff. Eaker called the 8th Air Force an unkept promise, highlighting the desperate need for resources. The numbers underscored this grim reality. Approximately 73% of combat flyers from summer and fall 1942 failed to complete their tour. A staggering 57% were killed or missing. Another 16% were wounded or grounded, their combat journeys abruptly ended. These were the harsh lessons learned in the crucible of early air warfare, lessons that revealed critical strategic and operational deficiencies. The very existence of the force was threatened. Yet, individual acts of heroism continued to shine through the darkness.